Magnus is one of the only traitor primarchs who regrets basically everything that's happened to him. And when you actually look at the lore, not the memes, not the shorthand version, the case that he did nothing wrong is a lot stronger than most people think. Leman Russ did try to warn him before the Space Wolves arrived at Prospero. Multiple contact attempts, multiple requests to surrender peacefully and send away the civilians. Magnus covered his world in a psychic shield and said nothing. Any honest reading of this case has to start there, because the strongest objection to the entire thesis sits right at the beginning of the story's most famous chapter. Understanding why Magnus chose silence, why he took the Thousand Suns fleet out of orbit, shut off the planetary defense grid, and wrapped Prospero in psychic darkness so his own legion couldn't sense the enemy approaching, is what the whole argument actually turns on. That choice looks like arrogance from the outside. From inside the primary sources, it looks like guilt. Graham McNeil's 1,000 Suns and Dan Abnett's Prospero Burns document it specifically, in the particular decisions Magnus made and the particular reasons the text gives for each one. A man accepting punishment he believes he deserves doesn't look like a victim. But the lore forces the question of what it took to bring him to that point, and who had been building the maze he walked through long before he knew the walls were there. The thesis is precise. Magnus wasn't perfect. At every major crisis point, his pride helped close doors that external forces were already trying to shut on him. The argument isn't that he was innocent. It's that he was genuinely trying to do the right thing at each decision point, was being outmaneuvered by something that had understood him better than he understood himself for decades, and whose arrogance made a compromised situation progressively worse. He is the only one of the traitor primarchs who never stopped knowing the difference between who he was and what he had become. The evidence runs chronologically. All of it's in the books. Before Nikaea, before Horus was corrupted, before anyone had spoken the word heresy outside a nightmare, the 15th Legion was being destroyed by its own gene seed. The flesh change was what they called it. Degenerative mutations that reduced proud Astartes warriors into mindless abominations, biologically indistinguishable from chaos spawn. 5 years into the Great Crusade, the mutations appeared, arriving on the heels of a spontaneous wave of psychic development that had swept through the entire Legion and initially seemed like a gift. By the time the Great Crusade's fleets reached Prospero and Magnus was finally reunited with his genetic sons, the flesh change had become a pandemic. The 1,000 Suns numbered barely 1,000 active warriors, the rest sealed in stasis chambers in their hundreds, waiting for a cure no one in the Imperium knew how to produce. Elements within the Imperial hierarchy were openly calling for the 15th to be disbanded and its members euthanized. The Legion's survival wasn't guaranteed. Magnus saved them. He used sorcerous means, an open-ended bargain with a warp entity whose true nature he didn't yet understand, to cure his Legion, restoring even those afflicted warriors who had been sealed away in stasis. The visible cost was one eye. The skin closed smooth over where it had been. Magnus believed he had bested the creature, believed he had bargained from a position of strength and skill, believed the flesh change was permanently halted through his own mastery of the warp. He had found the cure, he thought. He had won the negotiation. He had not won. 1,000 Suns establishes the architecture of what actually happened. The entity he believed he had outmaneuvered was Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the changer of ways. The flesh change cure was real, in exactly the way a trap's bait is real. The mutations went into remission. The Legion survived. Magnus walked away convinced he had demonstrated precisely what he always argued, that a skilled enough sorcerer could handle the warp without being consumed by it. That conviction was the most dangerous thing Tzeentch took from the bargain. Not the eye, the confidence. Magnus spent the next several decades of the Great Crusade reinforcing it. The Thousand Sons campaigned across dozens of worlds, used psychic power where other legions used mass assault, brought civilizations into compliance at a fraction of the casualties. Magnus accumulated knowledge obsessively, pulling arcane lore from long, isolated human cultures wherever the crusade took him, compiling it all into the Book of Magnus, a monumental tome of sorcery drawing on arcane lore gathered from across the galaxy. He carried it everywhere. It represented his fundamental conviction. Knowledge was safety. Knowledge was power. Knowledge was the path toward everything the Emperor claimed to be building. He and the Emperor had genuine closeness in those early decades. When the Great Crusade reached Prospero, they embraced and conversed as if they had known each other for years. And in the warp, through psychic contact maintained since Magnus was an infant in his gestation capsule, they arguably had. They traveled together into the Immaterium, studying it jointly. The Emperor shared secrets with Magnus that he shared with no other son. Magnus believed he was trusted. He believed the relationship was reciprocal, honest, special. During those same travels, Magnus discovered the Eldar webway and told his father about it with something close to excitement. The Emperor already knew. He told Magnus he was working on it and ordered Magnus to cease all researches into the field. A Thousand Sons records the aftermath. Magnus confided to Ahriman that when he had shared this great discovery with the Emperor, it turned out his father had already known and had ordered all research stopped. Magnus filed that away and continued pursuing his own paths. This is who walks into the Council of Nikaea, a man who has already been told to stop studying something sensitive, who has already made a deal with a chaos god without knowing it, who has already accumulated decades of evidence that his own judgment was more reliable than the rules around him. Tzeentch had been watching him develop this conviction for a very long time. The Council of Nikaea convened in 001.M31 on a newly terraformed frontier world. The Emperor in an ancient amphitheater on a high dais. Primarchs and legion leaders gathered from across the Imperium. The official subject was the future of unrestricted psychers within the Astartes legions. Within the first hours, it was equally clear that this was also the trial of Magnus the Red. He arrived expecting a debate. Sanguinius and Fulgrim met him at his landing pad, wearing expressions that told him this was something else. In the council chamber, the Space Wolves' chief rune priest, Other Weirdmake, opened proceedings with a formal condemnation of the Thousand Sons' specific psychic practices. Then, Mortarion rose to speak. Mortarion's argument against Magnus wasn't the raving of a man who hated psychers on instinct. It was structured, historically grounded, and genuinely difficult to dismiss. He had grown up on Barbarous, under the rule of psychic overlords who used sorcerous power to dominate and destroy the populations they governed. Warlords who demonstrated precisely the pattern Magnus claimed was impossible. Men who had eventually been consumed by what they wielded. Mortarion cataloged the ways in which uncontrolled psychic proliferation had historically preceded the worst catastrophes in human history. He invoked Old Night, the collapse of human civilization during the dark age of technology. He was arguing from evidence, and the evidence was hard to ignore. Leman Russ was present, but hidden. The Emperor had arranged for a contingent of Sisters of Silence to psychically screen Russ from Magnus's awareness, apparently anticipating that if Magnus could sense his brother's presence, he would lose whatever composure the situation required. That management style, working around Magnus's character rather than addressing it directly, would prove catastrophic for both of them. Targatai Yasuge, the head stormseer of the White Scars, had been working the undecided primarchs before Magnus arrived. The White Scars maintain their own tradition of psychic practice, rooted in discipline and limitation rather than the aggressive exploitation Magnus favored. Yasuge had genuine credibility as a moderate voice and had been making methodical progress arguing for stricter controls, proposing compromises that might thread the needle between Mortarion's concerns and Magnus's ambitions. The pro-psyker case, in Yasuge's patient hands, had real momentum going into the council's critical hours. Magnus took the floor and dismantled it in a single speech. His defense was eloquent, passionate, and failed entirely to engage with what was actually being debated. Rather than responding to Mortarian's specific catalog of historical disasters, Magnus made sweeping emotional appeals to the utopian future that unrestricted psychic development could produce. He argued that no knowledge was tainted in itself. Only the seeker who had been mastered by their learning, rather than mastering it, had truly fallen. He argued that the Thousand Sons had proved this empirically through decades of psychic practice without corruption. He urged the emperor not to shackle the search for knowledge and treated any limitation at all as a failure of courage. All of this was delivered with the oratory of a primarch. Yasuge watched the undecided primarchs being swept away from the moderate position he had carefully constructed toward Magnus's maximalist case, and there was nothing he could do. Every careful distinction Yasuge had been establishing between disciplined psychic practice and sorcery, between controlled librarius training and Magnus's unregulated methods, erased by a speech that treated any limitation as evidence of small thinking. The emperor, on his high dais, had been watching Magnus throughout. When accusations of specific sorcery practices were leveled and the evidence became difficult to dismiss, Magnus offered what may be his most famous line, preserved in the Lexiconum. "If I am guilty of anything, it's the simple pursuit of knowledge." Beautiful, utterly insufficient as a response to the charges. There was a secondary incident during a recess that the Prospero Burns narrative later resolves carefully. A figure appearing to be Ammon, one of the Thousand Sons' most senior captains, attempted to kill Caspar Hauser, a human skjald embedded with the Space Wolves, who had apparently been serving as a Thousand Sons intelligence asset. Abnett's novel later reveals this to have been a chaos entity in disguise rather than the actual Ammon. But in the moment, what the emperor saw was what appeared to be one of his son's senior officers moving to eliminate a witness inside an imperial conclave. The incident reached the emperor quickly. His ruling at Nikaea was total. The librarius departments of every legion would be disbanded. All psychically talented Astartes were forbidden from using their abilities and reassigned to battle lines. No exceptions. The ban was comprehensive, covering not just sorcery, but all unrestricted psychic practice. For Magnus personally, the emperor added a separate prohibition. Cease the practice of sorcery immediately. Abandon all pursuit of knowledge related to magic. Then the threat that would haunt everything that followed. His exact words at Nikaea, as recorded in the Battle of Prospero lore: "If you treat with the warp, Magnus, I shall visit destruction upon you, and your legion's name will be struck from the imperial records for all time." The fate the emperor was invoking wasn't hypothetical. The lost primarchs of the 2nd and 11th legions had already experienced exactly this. Their names erased, their existence scrubbed from imperial records, their fates unrecorded. He meant precisely what he said. His full ruling speech at Nikaea reveals a man whose concern was genuine and whose frustration with Magnus was personal. He treated power as something with its own momentum, argued that most men can endure adversity, but few can withstand the final test of wielding power without being consumed by it, called the warp a place of inconstancy and lies, warned that false knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance, and acknowledged that he had allowed his sons to explore matters he should never have permitted them to know existed. He was blaming himself as much as Magnus. He was also, unmistakably, describing Magnus when he warned that men always seek the shortcut to power, and that a man's own mind, not his enemies, would be what lured him toward ruin. This was a father watching his son walk toward an edge and throwing up a wall. Magnus returned to Prospero and ignored the wall completely. He met with his senior librarians, Ahriman, Uthazar, Hathor Mott, Phocis Takar, and persuaded them to collude in continuing their studies in secret. He kept practicing sorcery. He kept developing his Thousand Sons psychic techniques. A Thousand Sons confirms this without ambiguity. He had no intention of giving up the promised power and knowledge of the warp, and continued to study the immaterium and its secrets. He had been personally threatened, publicly censured, given the clearest possible statement of consequences. He defied it anyway because he trusted his own judgment more than his father's ruling. The sympathetic reading is real. A primarch ordered to abandon everything that defined his legion's identity by an emperor who was himself conducting a vast, warp-related project in secret beneath the imperial palace, was being asked to dismantle his sons while the man giving the order was doing something similar in a dungeon no one was allowed to enter. The critical reading is equally real. He had been warned explicitly and threatened with total destruction. He defied it because he trusted his own assessment more than anyone else's. Both readings live in the text. What they agree on is that this violation, continued secret sorcery after an explicit imperial ban, was the direct cause of the catastrophe that followed. In 004.M31, meditating in his tower on Prospero, Magnus peered into the warp with his single remaining eye and saw Horus. He saw Horus on the feral world of Davine, in the temple of the Serpent Lodge, undergoing a healing ritual arranged by Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, that was in truth a corruption trap. He saw Horus's soul bared to the ruinous powers, saw the betrayal taking hold, saw what it would grow into. He saw the entire shape of the coming disaster, the betrayal of half the Space Marine legions, the civil war that would split the Imperium, the deaths of primarchs, entire systems consumed by the conflict. He saw every participant's role. The only fate the vision didn't reveal was his own. He gathered his cabal, Ahriman, the fellowship captains who had been studying alongside him in defiance of Nikaea, and they deliberated over what the vision meant and what could be done. Magnus had attempted to reach Horus psychically during the ritual itself, trying to pull his brother back from the edge, and failed. What remained was the need to warn the Emperor before Horus could act. The sanctioned method was astro-telepathy, the Imperium's long-distance psychic communications network, operated by soul-bound astropaths working through approved relay chains. It was exactly the kind of psychic practice the Edict of Nikaea had explicitly preserved. It was also, as the Battle of Prospero entry notes, the far slower but legal option. An astropathic message about the War Master's corruption would travel through multiple relay stations, taking days or weeks to reach Terra. It could be intercepted or delayed by Horus's allies, who were throughout the command structure. A warning from a censured psyker about a precognitive vision. No physical evidence, just a sorcerer claiming to have seen the future, could be dismissed or suppressed. Magnus chose direct psychic transmission. He gathered the full combined power of his legion's greatest sorcerers, pooled their abilities into a single projection, and drove his astral form toward Terra through the warp. He violated the Edict of Nikaea openly and knowingly because he had decided the urgency of the threat outweighed the Emperor's ruling about methods. He believed he could handle this. His astral form blazed through the immaterium toward Terra. Somewhere in that journey, he found a webway corridor leading toward the Imperial Palace. 1,000 Suns records what happened next. He came across a webway corridor that led to Terra, unaware that this particular passage was built by the Emperor and formed part of his secret webway project. He tried to push through it. The walls resisted, far stronger than he could breach on his own. An anonymous voice from within the warp offered the power he needed to break through. Magnus accepted without asking who was offering, and tore the wall open. That voice was Tzeentch. For the third time in Magnus's life, the flesh change cure, the webway corridor, and once more before Prospero burned, the architect of fate placed a lifeline at the exact moment of maximum need, attached to terms Magnus didn't examine. His astral form burst through the portal beneath the golden throne. The Emperor and Magnus shared an instant of psychic connection. Magnus delivered what he had seen. The Emperor showed Magnus, in that same moment, what the delivery had cost. The warp had found a path into the Terran webway through the torn wall, and the path was open. The Emperor had directed tens of thousands of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests to build the Imperial Webway project through the modified Golden Throne beneath the Imperial Palace, the cornerstone of his plan to give humanity access to the Eldar Webway network, circumventing the warp entirely and securing the Imperium's future against the slow catastrophe of psyker dependency. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Master of Mankind details what the breach produced: a demonic incursion flowing through the Terran Webway tunnels that required the deployment of nearly the entire available force of the Legio Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, and a massive Adeptus Mechanicus contingent to contain. At the campaign's most desperate point, the containment operation could sustain a maximum loss of 4 Custodes warriors per day before the entire effort would become unsustainable. The repair work couldn't keep pace. The hole didn't close. The Emperor took his seat on the Golden Throne to stabilize the Webway's remaining integrity. Before the breach, he hadn't needed to sit there continuously. After it, he couldn't leave. That is why the Emperor is still on the Golden Throne 10,000 years later. The message Magnus sent out of genuine loyalty, in desperate urgency, to warn the Imperium about the coming betrayal, is the direct cause of the Emperor's imprisonment. He couldn't have known the full scope of what he was breaking, but he had been told to stay away from the Webway, had found a wall he couldn't breach alone, and had accepted power from an unknown source without asking the question that the entire pattern of his life should have made automatic. The Emperor expelled Magnus's astral form from the dungeon, and back on Prospero, 1,000 Suns records what the experience revealed to him. A power of the warp spoke to Magnus directly, revealing that he had been its pawn since the time it helped him save his legion from the flesh change, and perhaps even long before that. Magnus understood, in that moment, the full architecture of what had been done to him. He went into what the novel describes as a rampage of self-loathing. He didn't calculate defenses. He didn't reach for justifications. He sat with the weight of what his actions had caused and decided that punishment was what the situation required. That decision would define everything that came next. The Emperor sent Leman Russ to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment. The order was arrest, not execution, confirmed across every primary source covering this period. Capture Magnus, transport him home, determine what happened. The 1,000 Suns were to be held accountable, but not destroyed. Horus was already corrupted. He intercepted the communication during Russ's voyage to Prospero. His words, as recorded in the Burning of Prospero lore: "I have already contacted my brother Russ and illuminated him with the full breadth of Magnus's treacherous use of demonic spells and conjurations. He was suitably angry, and I believe I have convinced him that to return Magnus to Terra would be a waste of time and effort." Convinced, not ordered. Horus didn't need to forge written orders. Russ held broad operational authority in the field, and Horus understood exactly what kind of argument would move him. The contempt between Russ and Magnus predated the heresy by decades. Russ of Fenris, a death world where all psychers were feared as fell witches, had watched Magnus use warp power to do things no honest warrior would touch. He and Magnus had nearly come to blows on Archreach Secundus before Lorgar intervened. The old hatred was already there. Horus needed only to give it direction. The Imperial Censure Host that emerged from the warp above Prospero was assembled for a campaign. The Space Wolves Legion, elements of the Legio Custodes under Constantine Valdor, Sisters of Silence, Skitari cohorts, Legio Cybernetica Maniples, battle group praxis of the Legio Astorum, and multiple Imperial army regiments, an armada the Emperor had ordered to bring Magnus to account. What Horus had engineered was a change of objective, not a change of forces, turning his brother's existing contempt for Magnus into permission to seek death rather than arrest. Russ, on his own initiative, pulled back from immediate assault. Prospero Burns records it directly. Russ used Caspar Hauser as a psychic conduit to offer Magnus a last chance to surrender peacefully and send away the civilians. Russ received no reply. Avnet gives Russ the careful phrasing that the contact had been an alleged attempt to communicate a warning. The the word alleged suggesting Russ's own uncertainty about whether any message had actually reached the other side. It may not have. Magnus had wrapped Prospero in a psychic cocoon that blocked all astropathic communications and prevented his own Corvidae sorcerers from making prophetic readings beyond its surface. The shield designed to stop his legion from foreseeing the assault was simultaneously blocking any communication inward. Whether Russ's attempted warning penetrated the shield, was intercepted by Tzeentch's manipulation, or reached Magnus in some form he chose to ignore, 1,000 Suns, told from Magnus's perspective, depicts no warning arriving, while Prospero Burns, told from the Space Wolves side, depicts Russ making the attempt. Both novels are primary Black Library canon, describing the same events from opposite sides. The ambiguity between them isn't a continuity error. It's two witnesses describing the same dark room from different doorways. What isn't ambiguous is what Magnus had already done before any message could have arrived. He had shut down the orbital defense grid. The massive planetary defense lasers sunk into reinforced silos miles beneath Tizca, the orbital fire platforms, the automated tracking stations, all of it. He had dispersed the 1,000 Suns fleet from Prospero's orbit. He had wrapped the planet in the psychic cocoon. He had killed Captain Belek Uthizar, 5th Fellowship, the officer who had somehow learned of the incoming fleet and begun arranging defensive preparations. Killed him specifically to prevent the knowledge of the assault from spreading to the Legion. 1,000 Suns places this without ambiguity. Magnus murdered Uthizar when the captain learned of the invasion to come. One decision at a time, systematically, Magnus made his own home indefensible. He believed it was the right thing to do. He believed acceptance of punishment was the only morally appropriate response to what he had caused. He believed, somewhere, that this act of submission might mean something, might demonstrate to the emperor that his son could take responsibility. He was wrong about what it would produce. The censure host made planetfall unopposed. The assault on Tizca began. The Space Wolves attacked not just the 1,000 Suns' fortress pyramid structures, but the city's civilian population, the Prosperine Guard, everyone. The flesh change manifested under the stress of combat. Phocis Takar, captain of the 2nd Fellowship, transformed into a chaos spawn. Fael Torin, captain of the 7th, detonated in a kilometers-wide column of etheric power that pulled the warlord titan Canis Vertex down with him. The 1,000 Suns fell back toward the Pyramid of Photep, harassed by mutated wolfens, their own bodies beginning to fail them as combat stress triggered the very mutations their primarch had spent his life trying to cure. Magnus joined the battle when it appeared the final extinction of his legion had arrived. He and Leman Russ fought directly. Russ won. He raised Magnus over his head and broke his brother's back over his knee. 9/10 of the 1,000 Suns Legion were destroyed in the burning of Prospero. Hundreds of thousands of Prosperine civilians died. The subsequent bombardment was so intense that the surface of Prospero turned into featureless black glass. The lore distributes the weight for what happened on Prospero across multiple causes and refuses to assign it cleanly to any single party. Magnus made his own home indefensible out of guilt. Horus engineered the escalation from arrest to annihilation by manipulating Russ's existing contempt. Russ executed it with operational freedom he had been given and chose to use fully. The Emperor created conditions where secrecy was standard and communication was inadequate. No single reading captures the whole event, which is precisely why every simplified version of it tends to produce exactly the kind of pushback this audience delivers. His back broken, his world burning, his legion dying around him, Tzeentch made Magnus an offer. This was the second deal, and it needs to be separated from the first. The pre-heresy flesh change bargain had been made without Magnus knowing who he was dealing with. He had believed he was outmaneuvering a warp entity with superior sorceress skill. The ignorance was genuine, even if the outcome was disastrous. The Prospero offer came after decades of accumulating evidence about what these bargains cost. Magnus was physically destroyed, spine shattered, lying in the burning ruins of his city. Tzeentch offered salvation. Magnus, his surviving 1,000 sons, his accumulated knowledge, all of it preserved and transported beyond reach of further imperial vengeance. The primary sources record that Magnus pledged to preserve himself, his legion, his world, and all the knowledge he had accumulated. 1,000 Sons ends with Magnus finally, consciously giving in to the demonic voice that had been tempting him, invoking ancient sorceries to escape Prospero. The novel's own framing of the exchange carries deliberate ambiguity, what Tzeentch considered the full price of that salvation, and how clearly Magnus understood the terms he was accepting, the text implies rather than states. He was a man who had run out of alternatives before he had run out of choices, accepting an offer from the only party in the warp that had been holding one out since before he knew a game was being played. The surviving core of the 1,000 Sons, approximately 1,000 warriors, the terrible repetition of the number the Legion had carried every time it was rebuilt from near extinction, was teleported to Sortiarius, the planet of sorcerers in the Eye of Terror, a demon world that had been prepared for exactly this arrival. The Book of Magnus survived. The accumulated knowledge survived. Something survived. 1,000 Sons makes the architecture of this sequence visible in retrospect. Read across the full novel, from the flesh change cure, through Nikaea, through the webway breach, through Prospero. Tzeentch had been working the same pattern every time, placing a lifeline at the exact moment of maximum desperation, attaching terms Magnus was in no position to examine carefully, building the circumstances where his recurring response to impossible situations kept producing outcomes Tzeentch required. The flesh change cure, the webway corridor breach, the soul pledge. 3 moments of maximum vulnerability, 3 offers, 3 acceptances. He didn't need to corrupt Magnus. He needed Magnus to keep being Magnus, under conditions he had been engineering for decades. Here is what separates Magnus from every other Primarch who fell, and this is where the meme points at something the lore actually supports. Lorgar's fall was a decision made with full agency. After the Emperor ordered the Wordbearer's devotional worlds raised as a public humiliation, Lorgar spent decades in deliberate searching, exploring the galaxy in partnership with Erebus and Corferon, looking for powers worthy of the devotion he had been told to abandon. He found 4 of them and gave himself completely. His relationship with the ruinous powers throughout the Horus Heresy series is characterized as sincere theological devotion, complete, enthusiastic, carefully reasoned on his own terms. Lorgar ran toward chaos. Angron's fall was structurally complete before the heresy began. The butcher's nails, cranial implants surgically forced into his skull on the slave world of Nuceria before the Emperor found him, were slowly destroying his brain, eating away at his capacity for anything except rage, making every moment of calm feel like physical withdrawal from a substance that was simultaneously killing him. Regret requires the kind of self-awareness the nails had been methodically dismantling for decades. By the time of the Horus Heresy, Angron was already being consumed by a device he hadn't chosen and couldn't remove. Magnus arrived at his fall with full consciousness, intact memory, and the capacity for guilt that the primary sources document specifically and repeatedly. He watched Horus's corruption in a vision, and his immediate response was to try to warn his father, violating a law he believed was unjust in service of a loyalty that was genuine and desperate. He accepted punishment for the webway breach without deflection. 1,000 Sons records that he believed the destruction of Prospero was what justice required of him. He killed a warrior who tried to save Prospero because Magnus had decided Prospero shouldn't be saved, that his own judgment about what justice required outweighed his captain's survival instinct. That is the psychology of someone who feels responsible, not wronged. Graham McNeil's The Fury of Magnus covering the siege of Terra, adds the scene that crystallizes this most completely. Magnus infiltrated the imperial palace at the head of his forces, psychically disguised as blood angels. Moving through the great observatory, he encountered a group of civilians and saved them from phosphex bombs, without tactical reason, without strategic benefit to any mission objective, simply because they were there and about to die. Deep in the imperial dungeon, the Emperor offered him a psychic vision, a possible future where the primarchs never turned, where Magnus eventually sat at the golden throne in willing service, drifting with the Emperor through the immaterium in endless discovery of cosmic knowledge. The Emperor stated this future might still be possible. The price was the destruction of the 1,000 suns, too far gone by flesh change and corruption to follow Magnus back. Magnus refused. The people he had destroyed everything to protect were the price for saving himself. He wouldn't pay it. He struck at the Emperor and found himself in combat with Vulcan. And Vulcan made the point that couldn't be deflected. Magnus's arrogant and reckless use of sorcery had turned him into a slave to chaos. Magnus had no clean rebuttal. He tried manipulation. He tried distraction. He fought with increasing desperation until he gave himself wholly to the powers of chaos, not as a triumphant conversion, but as the last available move, the final collapse of all the other options. He was expelled from the Imperial dungeon by its anti-demonic wards, winged and cloven-hooved, and something that had been the Crimson King became something else entirely. Dan Abnett, who wrote the Space Wolves perspective on Prospero and has spent years working inside this lore, offered an observation about both parties. The Emperor is really just a bigger version of Magnus with some of the same flaws and tantrums. The Emperor who conducted a secret webway project without informing Magnus it existed, who worked through intermediaries rather than direct communication, who trusted secrecy over clarity at every critical juncture, and Magnus, who concealed his sorcery after Nikaea, who acted unilaterally because he trusted no one else's assessment of necessity, who believed the rules were for people who didn't understand the situation as well as he did. They share the same fundamental flaw. Two versions of the same arrogance in a universe where a god who specializes in impossible choices had been carefully ensuring that communication between them failed at exactly the moments that mattered most. 10,000 years after Prospero burned, Magnus the Red sits atop a tower on Sortiarius, the planet of sorcerers, planning the next stage of a war that has been running for 100 centuries. In 999 M41, during the siege of the Fenris system, he moved the entire planet. He used the deaths of the population of the death world of Midgardia, the whole world, sacrificed as ritual fuel, to teleport Sortiarius from the Eye of Terror into orbit above Prospero's ruins. The 1,000 Suns and Space Wolves fought across the Fenris system. The Wrath of Magnus campaign material describes it as a vendetta 10,000 years in the making. That's Magnus's framing, pursued with his own power over his own grievance. In the era Indomitus, following the birth of the Great Rift and the surge of psychic activity called the Psychic Awakening, Magnus has declared Prospero a haven for human psychers facing persecution under the Imperium's brutal sanctioning programs. He is building what the 1,000 Suns lore calls a new kingdom, where human psychers and sorcerers can gather to master their abilities without the prejudice and repression of the Imperium. The civilization he argued for at Nikaea, where psychic gifts are studied rather than suppressed, where sorcerers have a place rather than a pyre, he is constructing it now, on the glass that was once Tizca, on the ruins of everything the Space Wolves burned. He is also converting Prospero into a weapons manufactorum, a supply platform for the coming war against the Imperium. Both simultaneously, sanctuary and arsenal, refuge and preparation. This is very much Tzeentch's aesthetic, and it would be naive to claim otherwise. But the sanctuary is real in the lore, not a cover story. Magnus is doing both things at once because both are genuinely, inseparably true to who he is. The man who wanted a civilization of psychers at Nikaea, the man who served Tzeentch atop a tower in the Eye of Terror, The man who saved refugees from phosphex bombs in the middle of an assault on the imperial palace. All of these are the same person. He can't stop building things that look like the Imperium he was trying to save. The meme says Magnus did nothing wrong. The lore is more precise than that. He did several things wrong. He didn't disband the Librarius after Nikaea. He didn't use the slower legal method to warn the emperor when he had time to try. He didn't ask who was offering to break a wall that the most powerful being in human history had built and sealed. He killed Uthazar to prevent Prospero from being defended, at the cost of his own captain's life, for a submissive gesture that produced no mercy from anyone. These are real decisions, made by a real person, with real consequences that every primary source holds him accountable for. Almost none of them were evil. They were proud. They were impatient. They were the choices of a man who trusted his own judgment more than any external authority, because the external authority had never been reliably right before, and the warp had always bent to his skill, until it didn't. Every door that closed on Magnus had hands from outside helping it shut. A god who had been cultivating the exact pattern of decisions since before the heresy existed, who had first made contact when Magnus was trying to save his dying sons and didn't yet know who was offering the cure. Tzeentch didn't corrupt Magnus by offering him forbidden power to pursue. He found a man who reached for power in moments of desperate necessity and manufactured an unbroken sequence of those moments, each one at maximum vulnerability, each one offering exactly what Magnus needed at the price he was most likely to accept. He never stopped knowing what it cost. 1,000 Suns records it directly. When the full weight of the webway breach landed on Magnus, when he understood who had been using him and for how long, he didn't rage at the Emperor, didn't recalibrate towards self-defense. He accepted. He sat with it. He dismantled his own planet's defenses because he believed punishment was just. Lorgar ran toward chaos and never looked back. Angron was destroyed by hardware driven into his skull before he had a chance to choose. Magnus walked toward his damnation, understanding exactly where he was going, carrying a book of knowledge through a series of rooms he had helped build, toward a destination he spent eternity insisting he never meant to reach. The architect of fate's most ironic trophy is a being who tried harder than almost anyone to do right, who now serves a god of impossible choices for eternity, and who, from a tower on the planet of sorcerers, is still building the civilization he wanted to save, still carrying the same book, still knowing the difference. Subscribe for more arguments like this one.